Language is not the transparent mirror we trust. It is the architecture that quietly shapes what we believe reality is. Human beings assume that words simply describe the world. Yet language does something far more radical. It selects, frames, and limits what can appear to our mind as truth. What we call reality often arrives already filtered through the grammar of our thinking. Before psychology analyzed the unconscious of the individual, one philosopher began exposing the hidden structure beneath thought itself. Ludwig Wittgenstein stepped into philosophy with a brutal suspicion. When the intellectual world still believed philosophical problems required deeper theories, he saw something unsettling. Many of those problems were not mysteries of the universe. They were confusions produced by language itself. This insight did not arrive as a small correction. It fractured philosophy. Wittgenstein would eventually dismantle his own earlier system and rebuild his thinking from the ground up. His journey revealed a disturbing possibility. Perhaps humanity has been trapped not by ignorance, but by the very words we use to search for truth. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. What Wittgenstein ultimately confronted was not merely language. He confronted the limits of human understanding itself. When we speak, we believe we are revealing the world. But what if we are only moving within the boundaries of our linguistic tools? The exploration that follows traces this radical discovery step by step, from the claim that the world is a structure of facts to the realization that meaning lives in the way words are used in human life. Each step exposes another illusion about language, thought, and truth. And the journey begins with a simple but devastating proposition. The world is not a collection of things. It is a totality of facts. The world is not made of things. It is made of what happens. This is the first violence Ludwig Wittgenstein commits against our everyday intuition. We believe the world is a warehouse of objects, tables, trees, bodies, planets. Solid entities occupying space like silent witnesses of existence. But Wittgenstein strips that illusion away. The world, he insists, is not a pile of objects. The world is the totality of facts, the totality of events that occur and could occur. This claim is not poetic, it is surgical. Before the 20th century had even stabilized its philosophical language, before analytic philosophy became an academic empire, Wittgenstein had already seen something disturbing. Philosophers were asking questions about reality, while quietly assuming that reality was made of things. He rejected the assumption. The true structure of the world, he argued, lies not in objects themselves, but in the relations between them, in the situations they form, in the events that unfold. A chair alone means nothing. A chair beside a table, a cup placed on it, a person sitting there. These are not objects. These are states of affairs. And the world is nothing more than the sum of such states. This distinction is brutal but precise. Objects are merely possibilities. They are the building blocks of reality. But facts are the actual arrangements those blocks create. Reality is not the pieces. Reality is the configuration. Consider what this implies. When we describe the world, we do not list objects endlessly. We describe situations. We say the cup is on the table, the sky is dark, the door is open. Each sentence captures not an object, but a relationship between objects. Each statement depicts a possible arrangement of reality. Language does not mirror objects. Language mirrors facts. Here, the core argument emerges with sharp clarity. First, the world is composed of facts rather than things. This claim demands confrontation because it overturns a deeply rooted habit of thought. We instinctively treat objects as the fundamental units of existence. But objects alone are inert possibilities. They only become meaningful when they enter into relations. A stone lying on the ground is not yet a fact in the philosophical sense. The fact appears when something is asserted about it. The stone blocks the road. The stone breaks the glass. The stone rests beside another stone. Facts are structured occurrences. Misunderstanding this leads philosophers into confusion. They search for the essence of objects, as if reality were a museum catalog. Wittgenstein exposes the error. Reality is dynamic. Reality is relational. Objects only gain significance within a structure of events. The conclusion is severe. To understand the world is to understand the network of facts that compose it. Second, language reflects this structure. This is where Wittgenstein performs his most radical move. He refuses to treat language as merely a tool for communication. Instead, he treats it as a structural mirror of reality. A meaningful sentence works because its internal structure corresponds to a possible state of affairs in the world. Take a simple statement. The book lies on the table. This sentence is not random. Its elements correspond to elements of a situation. The word book points to an object. The word table points to another. The relation lies on mirrors the spatial relation between them. The sentence forms a model of the fact it describes. Meaning emerges from this mirroring. A sentence has sense only when it depicts a possible arrangement of reality. If the arrangement could exist, the sentence is meaningful. If the arrangement is logically impossible, the sentence collapses into nonsense. This is why Wittgenstein believes logic sits beneath language like an invisible skeleton. Logic determines which configurations of words correspond to possible configurations of the world. Many misunderstand this point. They assume Wittgenstein is saying language simply copies reality. That is not his claim. The relationship is subtler and more unsettling. Language and reality share a form. They are structured in comparable ways. Because of this shared logical form, sentences can represent facts. And once you see this, an uncomfortable question arises. How much of what we say actually corresponds to a possible fact? Third, meaning is inseparable from possibility. A sentence is meaningful not because it is true. A sentence is meaningful because it could be true or false. It describes a state of affairs that could exist. Truth, then, becomes a comparison between the sentence and reality. If the state of affairs exists, the sentence is true. If it does not, the sentence is false. But if the sentence describes something that cannot possibly exist, then it says nothing at all. This is the hidden discipline behind Wittgenstein's philosophy. He demands that language submit to logical possibility. Words must earn their meaning by depicting a conceivable arrangement of the world. Many philosophical statements fail this test. When philosophers speak of the absolute essence of being, the pure substance of the soul, or the metaphysical structure of ultimate reality, Wittgenstein asks a ruthless question. What fact in the world does this sentence depict? What arrangement of objects could make it true or false? If none can be imagined, then the sentence floats outside meaningful language. This realization shook philosophy at its core. For centuries, thinkers believed they were discovering deep metaphysical truths. Wittgenstein suspected something far more embarrassing. Many philosophical problems are not problems about reality. They are problems created by language misused. The consequences reach far beyond academic debate. Even today, in a world saturated with information and technology, we remain trapped inside language. We speak constantly. We write endlessly. We argue, declare, promise, accuse. But rarely do we stop to examine the structure beneath our words. We assume language transparently reveals reality. It does not. Language shapes how reality appears to us. The structure of our sentences quietly organizes the structure of our thought. When language becomes confused, thought becomes confused. And when thought becomes confused, entire cultures drift into conceptual fog. Modern life has not solved this problem. It has amplified it. We produce more language than any generation in history. Billions of messages, posts, headlines, speeches. Yet the clarity of meaning does not increase. It often collapses. Words multiply while precision evaporates. Statements circulate without clear reference to facts. Language becomes noise, pretending to describe reality. Wittgenstein would not be surprised. He believed that understanding language requires ruthless discipline. One must constantly ask what fact a sentence depicts. One must confront whether a statement corresponds to a possible arrangement of the world. Without this discipline, language becomes a trap. But the deepest dimension of Wittgenstein's insight is psychological. Human beings fear ambiguity. We crave certainty. Language offers the illusion that we possess it. When we name something, we feel we understand it. When we construct a theory, we feel we have captured reality. Yet Wittgenstein forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Words often outrun the facts they claim to describe. Inside the mind, this creates a subtle tension. We speak with confidence about things we cannot actually represent. Concepts expand beyond the limits of meaningful description. The intellect builds castles on foundations of air. And still we continue. Why? Because language gives us power. It allows us to impose structure on the chaos of experience. It creates the impression that the world is orderly, describable, manageable. Without language, we would face the raw immediacy of existence. Wittgenstein does not deny the necessity of language. He exposes its limits. To see this clearly, imagine a figure sitting quietly at a desk, a young soldier turned philosopher, a man who fought in war, inherited immense wealth, and abandoned comfort to pursue clarity. Ludwig Wittgenstein, writing the propositions that would become the Tractatus. Through this figure, we see the strange intensity of his project. He was not merely constructing a theory of language. He was trying to draw the boundary of meaningful thought itself, to show what can be said and what must remain unsaid. In this effort, he treated language like a map of reality. Each meaningful proposition marks a possible configuration of the world. Together they form the logical space within which facts can exist. Beyond that space lies silence. This insight does not comfort us, it confronts us. If the world is the totality of facts, then understanding reality requires more than naming objects. It requires grasping the structures that connect them. It requires recognizing how language models those structures. And it requires accepting that many things we attempt to say simply cannot be said. The modern mind resists this boundary. We want language to capture everything: meaning, beauty, ethics, the purpose of life. Yet Wittgenstein quietly draws a line across the landscape of thought. On one side lies what can be clearly stated: facts, logical relations, descriptions of the world. On the other side lies something more elusive, the domain where language begins to tremble, where words attempt to reach beyond the structure that gives them meaning. And once we recognize that language mirrors the structure of reality, another deeper question begins to press forward. If sentences represent facts because their structure resembles the structure of events, then perhaps language itself functions like a picture of the world. Not a picture made of images, but a picture made of logical form. And the moment we begin to see language in this way, the relationship between words and reality transforms again, revealing an even more radical idea waiting just beneath the surface. Language does not merely describe reality, it constructs a picture of it. This is the next step in Wittgenstein's relentless attempt to strip philosophy down to its skeleton. If the world is the totality of facts rather than things, then language must somehow correspond to those facts. But how exactly does this correspondence occur? What allows a string of words to represent a structure in reality? Wittgenstein's answer is both simple and unsettling. A meaningful sentence functions as a picture of a possible situation in the world. Not a visual picture made of colors and shapes, but a logical picture, a structure that mirrors the structure of a fact. This idea, later called the picture theory of language, changes the entire landscape of philosophy. Before Wittgenstein, many thinkers believed language worked by attaching words to objects. Words were treated like labels. A word names a thing. The collection of names then forms a description of reality. But Wittgenstein saw immediately that this model fails. Naming alone cannot explain meaning. A list of words does not yet form a meaningful statement. The words cat, table, and sleep, placed side by side, tell us nothing. Meaning emerges only when those elements are arranged into a structure. The cat sleeps on the table. Now something appears that did not exist before. The sentence depicts a possible arrangement of objects. It creates a model of a situation. The structure of the sentence corresponds to the structure of a potential fact. This structural correspondence is what allows language to represent reality. The sentence becomes a logical image. This is the first layer of Wittgenstein's argument. Language represents the world because its structure mirrors the structure of facts. But what does this mirroring actually mean? A picture represents something not because it resembles it visually, but because its elements correspond to elements of the thing it represents. A map of a city does not look like the city itself. Streets on the map are lines. Buildings become small shapes. Yet the map works because the relations between those shapes correspond to the relations between streets and buildings in reality. The structure is preserved. Language operates in exactly the same way. Words correspond to objects. The arrangement of words corresponds to the arrangement of objects in a possible state of affairs. Because of this structural alignment, the sentence becomes capable of representing reality. This is not metaphor. It is logical architecture. Wittgenstein believed every meaningful proposition functions as such a picture. Each one outlines a possible configuration of the world. Some of these configurations actually exist, others do not. But the sentence remains meaningful because it depicts something that could exist. This leads to the second layer of his argument. A proposition is meaningful only if it depicts a logically possible situation. Truth and falsity arise only after this condition is satisfied. When a sentence depicts a possible state of affairs, reality determines whether the statement is true or false. But if the sentence attempts to depict something that cannot exist within the logical structure of the world, then the statement collapses into nonsense. This distinction is crucial. A meaningful proposition says something about the world. A nonsensical proposition only appears to do so. Philosophy, Wittgenstein believed, had been drowning in such illusions. Philosophers constructed elaborate systems built on sentences that lacked clear logical pictures. They spoke about ultimate substances, infinite essences, metaphysical foundations of reality. Yet when examined carefully, these statements fail to depict any clear possible state of affairs. The language appeared profound. The structure was empty. And Wittgenstein demanded that philosophy confront this problem without mercy. Logic becomes the weapon. Logic is not simply a branch of mathematics for him. Logic is the underlying structure shared by language and the world. It defines the boundaries within which meaningful pictures can exist. If a sentence violates logical form, it cannot represent reality. Because of this, logic becomes the foundation for understanding both language and the world. Many philosophers before Wittgenstein treated logic as a tool used to analyze arguments. Wittgenstein reverses the perspective. Logic is not merely a method of reasoning. It is the framework that makes representation possible in the first place. Language mirrors the world because both share a logical structure. Once this insight is accepted, an unsettling realization begins to unfold. Every meaningful statement we make is a model, a structured representation of a possible situation. Each sentence constructs a miniature world within language, a world whose elements correspond to objects and relations in reality. And yet, most of us speak without ever recognizing this silent architecture beneath our words. We treat language casually. We assume meaning is obvious. But Wittgenstein shows that meaning depends on an invisible alignment between language and reality, a fragile alignment that can collapse easily. Consider how often language creates the illusion of understanding. We hear a complex sentence and feel that something deep has been expressed. Yet, if we attempt to identify the fact it depicts, the structure dissolves. The words float without anchor. The statement gestures towards something, but never actually describes a possible situation. This is not rare. it happens constantly. Modern discourse, especially in an age saturated with information, often disguises confusion with sophistication. Words multiply, sentences become longer, concepts become abstract, yet the connection between language and possible facts becomes weaker. Wittgenstein would see this not as intellectual progress, but as philosophical danger, because when language loses its connection to the logical structure of reality, thought itself becomes unstable. Human beings rarely notice this instability because language provides a powerful psychological comfort. Words create the feeling of mastery. When we name something, we believe we understand it. When we construct explanations, we believe we have grasped the truth. But Wittgenstein strips away that comfort. Language does not guarantee understanding. It only offers the possibility of representation. Whether that representation corresponds to reality remains an open question. Inside the human mind, this creates a quiet tension. We depend on language to navigate existence, yet language itself contains traps. Its grammar can produce forms that look meaningful while actually describing nothing. The mind is easily deceived by such forms. We ask questions like, what is the essence of existence? Or what is the substance of consciousness? These questions appear profound, but Wittgenstein forces a brutal interrogation. What state of affairs would make such a statement true? What configuration of objects does the sentence depict? If no such configuration can be imagined, then the sentence does not reveal a mystery of reality. It reveals a confusion within language. This realization transforms philosophy from speculation into diagnosis. The philosopher becomes less like a scientist discovering new truths and more like a therapist examining the structure of thought. The task is no longer to produce grand theories about the universe. The task is to examine the logical pictures hidden within our language and determine whether they actually depict anything. This is an act of intellectual discipline that few are willing to endure, because it requires confronting the limits of our own expressions. Wittgenstein himself embodied this discipline with unsettling intensity. Those who encountered him often described his presence as severe, almost ascetic. He demanded absolute clarity. He refused vague answers. When a student made a philosophical claim, he would push relentlessly until the logical structure of the sentence became visible. Either the sentence depicted a possible fact or it collapsed into confusion. There was no middle ground. Through this relentless method, he attempted to map the entire structure of meaningful language. Each proposition, each logical relation, each possible configuration of facts forming a vast logical space. Within this space, language could depict the world. Outside it, language lost its grip on reality. And yet something strange began to appear at the edge of this logical space. Certain aspects of human life resisted representation. They could not be reduced to logical pictures. They could not be captured by propositions that describe possible states of affairs. Ethics, beauty, the meaning of existence. People speak about these constantly. Entire civilizations are built around them. Yet Wittgenstein began to suspect that these matters do not function like ordinary facts in the world. They do not appear as configurations of objects that can be depicted by logical propositions. Language approaches them, but never fully captures them. The picture begins to blur. And as Wittgenstein followed this realization deeper, he began to see that language itself possesses boundaries beyond which meaningful propositions cannot extend. The moment language tries to cross that boundary, it begins to fail. But that failure does not mean those dimensions of life are meaningless. It means something far more unsettling. There are truths that cannot be spoken, and once the structure of language is understood as a system of logical pictures, the existence of such unspeakable realities becomes impossible to ignore, pressing quietly against the edge of language itself. Language reaches a boundary long before human longing does. This is the moment Wittgenstein forces philosophy to confront a brutal limit. If language functions as a logical picture of possible facts, then its power depends entirely on what can be structured as a fact. A proposition must depict a possible arrangement of the world. Only then can it possess meaning. Only then can it be true or false. But human life constantly pushes beyond that structure. There are experiences we feel with absolute certainty, yet cannot translate into a clear picture of reality. We speak about beauty. We speak about moral goodness. We speak about the meaning of existence. Yet when we attempt to construct a logical proposition that depicts these things as a fact among other facts, the structure collapses. Wittgenstein saw this collapse with ruthless clarity. There are things that cannot be said. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a limitation of vocabulary. It is a structural limit built into language itself. Language works by depicting possible states of affairs. But some dimensions of existence do not appear as states of affairs in the world. They do not exist as configurations of objects that could be represented, like the sentence describing a cup on a table. They exist differently. Before most philosophers recognized the danger hidden inside their own language, Wittgenstein had already drawn the boundary. He had already seen that logic gives language power, but also imposes a border. Within that border, propositions describe facts. Outside it, language becomes incapable of representation. This insight did not arrive gently. It emerged from the extreme intellectual climate of the early 20th century, when many philosophers believed logic could solve every philosophical problem. Wittgenstein himself initially shared this hope. His early work attempted to map the entire logical structure of meaningful language. But as the map grew clearer, the border became visible. And beyond that border lay something that could not be captured in propositions. The first dimension that escapes language is ethics. People speak endlessly about good and evil. Entire legal systems, religions, and moral traditions are built upon these ideas. Yet Wittgenstein confronts a disturbing question. What fact in the world corresponds to the sentence, "good is valuable," or "murder is morally wrong"? A fact describes a configuration of objects. A chair stands in the room. A stone breaks a window. A person walks through a door. These statements depict states of affairs that could exist or fail to exist. But moral value does not appear among such configurations. You can describe every physical detail of an event. You can describe a man lifting a weapon. You can describe the movement of the blade, the fall of the body, the blood on the ground. Every observable fact can be recorded with precision. Yet the moral horror of the act does not appear within those facts themselves. It stands outside them. Ethics is not another fact among facts. It does not belong to the structure of the world in the way objects and events do. Wittgenstein realized that ethical meaning cannot be expressed through propositions that describe reality. It can only show itself. The same is true for aesthetics. When someone says, "This music is beautiful," or "This painting possesses profound beauty." The sentence appears meaningful. Yet, if we search for the facts it depicts, we encounter the same difficulty. The painting consists of shapes and colors arranged in a certain pattern. Those arrangements can be described, but the beauty experienced by the observer is not a configuration of objects within the painting. Beauty does not exist as a fact in the world. It appears through our experience of the world. This leads to the second branch of Wittgenstein's insights. The most important dimensions of human life lie beyond the limits of language. This claim does not diminish those dimensions. It elevates them into a strange philosophical territory where language cannot fully operate. Ethics, aesthetics, and the meaning of life are not meaningless simply because they cannot be expressed in propositions. They are unsayable. This distinction is crucial. Meaningless language attempts to describe something but fails because it violates logical form. The unsayable, however, points towards something real that cannot be captured by the structure of propositions. Wittgenstein did not dismiss ethics or meaning. On the contrary, he believed these were the most important aspects of existence. But their importance lies precisely in the fact that they cannot be reduced to factual statements about the world. They reveal themselves differently. They show themselves in how we live, how we experience the world, how we confront suffering, how we respond to beauty. Language circles around these experiences, but never fully encloses them. This realization strikes at the deepest psychological instinct of the human mind. We want to articulate everything. We believe that if something truly matters, it must be expressible in words. Yet Wittgenstein forces us to confront the opposite possibility. The most important truths may resist language entirely. This resistance creates a strange tension within the human psyche. On one side stands the intellect, armed with language, logic, and analysis. On the other side stands the lived reality of existence, filled with values, meaning, dread, hope, and moral struggle. Language attempts to bridge the gap. Often it fails. And when it fails, philosophers historically tried to force language further, constructing increasingly complex metaphysical theories in an attempt to describe what cannot be described. Wittgenstein rejects this approach completely. For him, the moment language reaches its limit, philosophy must stop speaking. Not because nothing exists beyond that limit, but because language no longer functions there. This insight transforms the task of philosophy itself. Philosophy is not meant to explain everything. Philosophy must clarify what can be said clearly and recognize what must remain silent. In a world obsessed with explanation, this demand appears almost radical. Modern culture equates knowledge with articulation. If something cannot be explained, it is often dismissed as confusion. Yet Wittgenstein reverses this assumption. The inability of language to capture certain truths does not invalidate those truths. It reveals their depth. Consider the experience of meaning in one's life. A person may feel with absolute certainty that their existence carries significance. This sense may guide their choices, shape their sacrifices, determine the direction of their life. Yet, if someone demands a factual description of that meaning, the language begins to falter. Where exactly does meaning exist? Is it an object, a measurable property, a physical relation between events? None of these descriptions capture the phenomenon. Meaning is experienced rather than depicted. Wittgenstein believed that attempting to transform such experiences into factual propositions distorts their nature. The attempt forces language into territory where it cannot operate properly. And when language enters that territory, philosophical confusion begins. This is why many philosophical debates appear endless. Participants argue about concepts that cannot be represented within the logical structure of language. Each side constructs sentences that sound meaningful, but fail to depict any possible state of affairs. The debate continues indefinitely because the participants are no longer speaking about facts. They are trapped in linguistic illusion. Wittgenstein's solution is severe but clear. Philosophy must learn to recognize the boundary of language. It must understand which statements depict facts and which attempt to say what can only be shown. Beyond that boundary lies silence. But this silence is not emptiness. It is filled with the dimensions of life that matter most. The ethical demand we feel when confronted with injustice, the awe experienced before beauty, the quiet recognition that existence itself carries significance beyond any factual description. These realities do not appear within language as propositions. They appear through life itself. The philosopher who recognizes this does not attempt to construct theories about them. Instead, the philosopher acknowledges their presence while remaining silent about their structure. Wittgenstein captured this attitude with remarkable severity. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. This sentence is not an escape from philosophy. It is a transformation of it. Because once the limits of language are understood, a deeper problem begins to reveal itself. Many philosophical confusions arise precisely because language allows us to construct sentences that appear meaningful even when they describe nothing at all. Grammar creates illusions. Words combine in ways that look logically structured, yet the resulting sentences depict no possible fact and express no genuine insight beyond the boundary of language. And when philosophers fail to notice this, entire systems of thought emerge from misunderstandings hidden within the structure of language itself. Philosophy collapses the moment language begins to deceive us. This is the ruthless suspicion that emerges from Wittgenstein's exploration of the limits of language. If meaningful statements must depict possible facts, and if certain dimensions of life lie beyond what language can represent, then a disturbing possibility appears. Many philosophical problems may not be problems about reality at all. They may be illusions created by language itself. Wittgenstein did not arrive at this conclusion gently. He arrived through confrontation. After mapping the logical structure of propositions and identifying the boundary between what can be said and what can only be shown, he began to see that philosophy repeatedly crosses that boundary without noticing. Philosophers construct sentences that appear meaningful, grammatically correct, and intellectually impressive. Yet beneath the surface, those sentences depict nothing. Language, when misused, becomes a trap. Before most thinkers had even suspected the danger, Wittgenstein already recognized that grammar possesses a strange power. It allows us to form sentences that resemble meaningful descriptions of reality, even when no corresponding fact exists. Grammar gives words a structure that imitates logic, and this imitation seduces the mind. A sentence can look correct while secretly saying nothing. This insight strikes at the center of traditional philosophy. For centuries, philosophers attempted to answer questions about the essence of reality, the nature of the self, the substance of consciousness, the ultimate foundation of existence. Entire systems of thought were built upon these questions. Wittgenstein asked a brutal question: do these sentences actually depict anything? Take a familiar philosophical statement: the self is a substance that underlies experience. The grammar of the sentence is perfectly ordinary. It resembles the structure of factual statements such as, the stone lies on the ground, or the tree stands in the field. The mind naturally assumes the sentence refers to something real. But Wittgenstein demands precision. What state of affairs does this sentence depict? What arrangement of objects would make the statement true or false? Where exactly in the world does this substance, called the self, appear? The question reveals the problem immediately. The sentence looks meaningful because its grammar imitates factual description. Yet when we attempt to identify the fact it describes, we find none. The sentence has grammatical form, but lacks logical reference to any possible configuration of the world. This is not deep philosophy. This is linguistic confusion. The first branch of Wittgenstein's argument emerges here with brutal clarity. Many philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding the way language works. Human beings trust grammar too easily. When language presents a sentence with a clear structure, we instinctively assume the sentence refers to something real. Grammar gives us nouns, verbs, and predicates that mimic the structure of facts. The mind then imagines that corresponding entities must exist. But grammar does not guarantee reality. The word time behaves grammatically like a noun. Because of this, philosophers ask questions such as, what is the substance of time? Or, does time flow like a river? These questions appear profound, yet Wittgenstein forces us to examine the structure of language itself. Does the word time actually refer to an object? Does it function like a table or a stone within the structure of facts? Or is the word merely part of a linguistic system used to organize events? Once the question is asked clearly, the illusion begins to dissolve. Language had tricked us into imagining a mysterious entity where none exists. This pattern repeats endlessly throughout the history of philosophy. Grammar creates the appearance of entities that correspond to words. Philosophers then attempt to analyze these imaginary entities. Entire debates emerge about their nature, their properties, their relation to the world. The debates persist for centuries because they are built on linguistic shadows. Wittgenstein refuses to participate in this theater. For him, the task of philosophy changes radically. Philosophy should not construct theories about the ultimate nature of reality. Philosophy should clarify how language functions so that such confusions disappear. This is the second branch of his argument. The role of philosophy is not explanation, but clarification. Traditional philosophy often behaves like science. It attempts to produce theories that explain the fundamental structure of the world. Wittgenstein rejects this ambition completely. He believes philosophy has misunderstood its own task. Philosophy should not compete with science. Science investigates facts about the world. It constructs hypotheses, performs experiments, and develops theories that describe physical reality. Philosophy operates on a different level. Its responsibility is to examine the language through which we think and speak about those facts. When philosophical confusion arises, the cause is rarely a missing scientific explanation. The cause is usually a misunderstanding of how language is being used. Philosophy must therefore function as a kind of intellectual therapy. It examines the sentences we use. It analyzes their logical structure. It asks whether they actually depict possible states of affairs. When confusion appears, philosophy dissolves it by clarifying the language that created it. The philosopher becomes less like a discoverer of cosmic truths and more like a surgeon removing conceptual tumors from the mind. This transformation is radical. Instead of building grand metaphysical systems, Wittgenstein proposes that philosophy should dismantle them. Instead of inventing new explanations of reality, philosophy should expose the linguistic illusions that created the questions in the first place. Many philosophers found this proposal disturbing. It seemed to reduce philosophy to something smaller, almost modest. But Wittgenstein believed the opposite. He believed this discipline demanded extreme intellectual honesty. To examine language carefully is to confront the habits of thought that shape our perception of the world. It requires recognizing when a question has been constructed incorrectly. It requires accepting that some philosophical problems disappear once the language generating them is clarified. This idea leads directly into the psychological dimension of Wittgenstein's thought. Human beings resist the dissolution of philosophical problems. We become emotionally attached to them. Grand questions about the nature of the self or the ultimate meaning of reality give the intellect a sense of importance. They create the impression that we are approaching the deepest mysteries of existence. But Wittgenstein reveals a humiliating possibility. Some of these mysteries exist only because language has misled us. The mind prefers complexity. It prefers problems that appear profound and difficult. Admitting that a philosophical puzzle is merely a confusion of language can feel disappointing. It removes the drama from the intellectual struggle. Yet Wittgenstein insists that clarity is more valuable than drama. The philosopher must be willing to dismantle entire traditions of thought if those traditions are built upon linguistic misunderstanding. This is not destruction for its own sake. It is liberation from illusions that have trapped thought for centuries. To illustrate this transformation, imagine a thinker confronting one of the most persistent philosophical questions in history. What is the nature of the mind? For centuries, philosophers proposed theories. Some argued that the mind is a separate substance distinct from the body. Others argued that the mind is identical with physical processes in the brain. Debates multiplied. Concepts became increasingly abstract. Wittgenstein approaches the problem differently. Instead of asking what the mind is, he examines how the word mind functions within language. How do we use the word in everyday life? What kinds of situations does it describe? What behaviors, expressions, and experiences does it connect? The investigation reveals something surprising. The concept of the mind does not behave like the name of an invisible object hidden inside the body. It operates within a network of linguistic practices involving thinking, remembering, feeling, intending. The confusion arises when we treat the word mind as if it referred to a mysterious substance. The philosophical problem dissolves once the linguistic illusion is exposed. This approach transforms philosophy into an activity rather than a doctrine. Philosophy does not produce new knowledge about the world in the way science does. It clarifies the language through which we attempt to describe the world. When that clarification succeeds, many philosophical puzzles simply vanish. But Wittgenstein's own intellectual journey did not end here, because as he continued reflecting on language, another difficulty emerged. The early framework he had constructed, where language mirrors the world through logical pictures, worked well for describing simple propositions about facts. Yet, human language in everyday life does far more than describe facts. People ask questions, they give orders, they tell stories, they joke, they pray, they express emotions, they negotiate social relationships, they create metaphors and irony and poetry. These forms of language do not behave like simple pictures of reality. The logical structure that once appeared sufficient to explain meaning now began to feel too narrow. Language in real life was richer, messier, and more flexible than the strict logical model suggested. And slowly, Wittgenstein began to realize that the philosophical framework he had built with such intensity might itself be another illusion, created by the desire for perfect logical clarity. Clarity can become another illusion. This is the quiet crisis that eventually emerges from Wittgenstein's early philosophy. He had drawn the boundaries of language with surgical precision. He had shown how propositions function as pictures of reality. He had exposed how many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings of grammar. For a moment, it seemed that philosophy had finally been disciplined by logic. But reality refused to obey the system. Language in the living world did not behave like the clean, logical structure described in the early theory. Human speech was chaotic, emotional, social, unpredictable. It did not merely describe facts. It commanded, begged, joked, promised, threatened, prayed, and mourned. It carried irony, metaphor, anger, and affection. The logical picture theory explained only a narrow fragment of what language actually does. And Wittgenstein saw the problem with brutal honesty. The system he had built was too perfect to be true. Before many philosophers even recognized the tension, Wittgenstein began dismantling his own work. This act remains one of the most extraordinary intellectual reversals in modern philosophy. Very few thinkers possess the courage to abandon the system that made them famous. Wittgenstein did not hesitate. He understood something fundamental. A theory of language that ignores the complexity of human life cannot survive contact with reality. The first fracture appeared when Wittgenstein looked closely at everyday speech. In the logical model, a meaningful proposition represents a possible fact. But ordinary language rarely functions this way. When a person says, "close the door," the sentence does not depict a state of affairs. It does not represent a fact that could be true or false. It performs an action. Language here becomes behavior. This observation seems simple at first, yet it shatters the earlier framework. If language is not limited to describing facts, then meaning cannot be explained solely through logical pictures. Something deeper is occurring whenever humans speak. Wittgenstein realized that language lives inside human activity. Words are not static mirrors of reality. They are tools embedded in forms of life. A word gains meaning not merely by representing an object, but by participating in a practice. To understand a word is not simply to identify what it refers to. It is to understand how it functions within the patterns of human interaction. The earlier logical system suddenly appears fragile. It assumed that language possesses a single underlying structure, grounded in logic. But real language refuses to conform to such uniformity. Instead, it behaves like a vast landscape filled with different practices, different purposes, different forms of expression. The philosopher who expects perfect logical order becomes lost in this landscape. The second fracture emerges from the emotional dimension of language. Human speech constantly expresses states of mind. A cry of pain does not represent a fact about suffering. It expresses suffering directly. The sentence, "I am afraid," may look like a description, but in many situations it functions as a confession, a request for comfort, or a signal of vulnerability. These uses cannot be reduced to logical pictures of the world. The earlier theory assumed that language operates primarily through representation, but human life reveals that language also operates through expression, command, ritual, and countless other forms. Meaning, therefore, cannot be reduced to logical structure alone. Wittgenstein's recognition of this fact was not a minor adjustment. It was the collapse of an entire philosophical architecture. The idea that logic could provide the foundation for all meaningful language began to dissolve. Yet this collapse did not lead Wittgenstein into despair. Instead, it pushed him toward a deeper understanding of language. To see why this shift was necessary, we must confront a psychological reality that Wittgenstein understood with unsettling clarity. Human beings crave simple theories. We prefer explanations that impose order on complexity. When philosophers discover an elegant system, they are tempted to believe they have captured the essence of reality. But language is not a machine designed according to a single blueprint. It is a living practice shaped by human needs, social interactions, cultural traditions, and emotional expressions. It evolves, it adapts, it refuses to remain confined within rigid logical boundaries. The early theory treated language like a perfectly engineered structure. But real language resembles a sprawling city that has grown over centuries. Streets twist unpredictably. Old structures coexist with new ones. Some districts follow clear patterns, while others appear chaotic. There is no single design governing the entire city. This realization forces philosophy to change its method. Instead of searching for a universal, logical structure underlying all language, the philosopher must examine the countless ways language is actually used. Meaning begins to shift from representation to practice. This transformation reflects a deeper existential insight about the human condition. Language is not merely a mirror of reality. It is part of the way human beings inhabit the world. Through language, we form relationships, establish norms, create communities, and express inner states that cannot be captured through pure logic. The structure of language therefore reflects the structure of human life. And human life is not governed by a single logical pattern. Wittgenstein's willingness to confront this complexity reveals something rare in the history of philosophy. He refused to defend his earlier ideas once he recognized their limitations. Many thinkers protect their systems even when evidence begins to undermine them. Wittgenstein chose the opposite path. He dismantled his own philosophy. This intellectual honesty demands enormous psychological strength. To abandon a theory is to abandon a part of one's identity. Wittgenstein has spent years constructing the logical framework of the Tractatus. The work had been celebrated as a revolutionary achievement, yet he began to see that the system captured only a narrow slice of language. The collapse of that certainty forced him into a deeper investigation. Instead of seeking logical purity, he turned his attention to ordinary language. How do people actually use words in daily life? How does meaning emerge from social interaction? How do expressions acquire significance through context and practice? These questions opened an entirely new direction for philosophy. The earlier image of language as a mirror reflecting reality began to fade. In its place emerged a more dynamic vision. Language functions as an activity embedded in human life. Words acquire meaning through the roles they play within that activity. Understanding language, therefore, requires observing how it operates within real situations. This insight carries a subtle psychological challenge. It demands that philosophers abandon the dream of ultimate theoretical simplicity. Instead of constructing abstract systems detached from lived experience, they must examine the messy reality of human communication. Philosophy becomes less like architecture and more like anthropology. The philosopher studies language as it appears within the practices of everyday life. Questions about meaning are answered not by analyzing logical form alone, but by examining how words are used within particular contexts. And as Wittgenstein continued this investigation, another idea slowly began to take shape. If language derives its meaning from the activities in which it is used, then different human activities may generate different patterns of language. Each pattern may follow its own rules, its own logic, its own form of meaning. Language would no longer appear as a single unified system. It would resemble a collection of distinct practices woven into the fabric of human life. And the moment Wittgenstein began to see language in this way, a new concept emerged that would transform the philosophy of language completely. Meaning is not hidden inside words. Meaning emerges from how we use them. This is the turning point in Wittgenstein's philosophical journey. The collapse of the earlier logical system forced him to confront a deeper truth about language. Words do not carry fixed essences. They do not possess meaning the way objects possess weight or shape. Meaning lives in practice. Meaning is use. This statement sounds simple. It is not. It dismantles centuries of philosophical assumptions. For generations, thinkers believed that every word must correspond to some inner essence or object. Philosophers searched for the true definition of concepts, as if each word pointed toward a hidden entity waiting to be discovered. Wittgenstein exposes the illusion. Words do not function like labels attached to fixed things. They behave like tools within human activity. A tool does not reveal its purpose through definition alone. Its purpose becomes clear only when we observe how it is used. The same is true for language. Take a single word, such as promise. What is the essence of a promise? Philosophers might attempt to define it through abstract analysis. They might search for the necessary conditions that transform a statement into a promise. But Wittgenstein approaches the question differently. Instead of asking what a promise is, he asks how the word promise is used in human life. We promise in moments of commitment. We promise to reassure someone. We promise to establish trust. We promise in legal agreements, in friendships, in moments of love or desperation. The meaning of the word does not reside in a hidden definition. It emerges from the pattern of its use across these situations. To understand the word is to understand the practice. This insight forms the first branch of Wittgenstein's new argument. Words have no fixed essence. Human thought instinctively seeks stability. We prefer to believe that concepts possess clear boundaries and precise definitions. This desire creates philosophical problems. When we cannot locate the essence of a concept, we assume that the concept itself must be mysterious or metaphysically complex. But Wittgenstein suggests something far simpler. Many words function without possessing strict definitions at all. Consider the word game. It appears to name a category of activities. Yet, when we examine the activities called games, a strange pattern appears. Some games involve competition, others do not. Some require skill, others depend on luck. Some are played for amusement, others are serious contests. There is no single feature shared by all games, and yet the concept functions perfectly in everyday language. People use the word game without confusion. They recognize when an activity belongs within the category, even though no precise definition exists. The concept operates through a network of similarities rather than a fixed essence. Meaning does not depend on rigid boundaries. It depends on how words are woven into human life. This realization forces philosophy to abandon a long-standing obsession. The search for the ultimate definition of every concept begins to look misguided. Language is not a system of perfectly defined terms. It is a fluid practice shaped by context, culture, and human interaction. Meaning evolves through use. The second branch of Wittgenstein's insight pushes this idea even further. Meaning is social. Words gain their significance within shared human practices. A child learns language not by memorizing definitions, but by participating in activities. The child observes how adults use words, imitates their behavior, receives correction, and gradually acquires the ability to navigate the patterns of language. Understanding a word, therefore, means knowing how to use it within the life of a community. This observation undermines a powerful philosophical illusion. Many thinkers believed meaning exists privately within the mind. According to this view, a word represents an inner idea or mental object. Communication occurs when one person transfers that idea to another through language. Wittgenstein challenges this model. If meaning were purely private, communication would be impossible. Words function because their use is governed by shared practices. The meaning of a word becomes stable through the public patterns in which it appears. Language is not an isolated mental code. It is a social activity. This insight carries deep psychological implications. Human beings often imagine themselves as isolated minds, observing the world from within their own consciousness. Language then appears as a bridge connecting these separate minds. But Wittgenstein reverses the perspective. Language is the environment in which our minds develop. It is the medium through which thought becomes possible. We do not first possess private meanings and then attach words to them. We acquire meaning by participating in the practices of language. Our inner life grows within a linguistic world that already exists. This realization forces us to reconsider how thought itself functions. Many philosophical traditions treat thinking as an internal process independent of language. Words merely express thoughts that already exist in the mind. Wittgenstein suspects the opposite. Thinking often occurs through language itself. Our capacity to reason, reflect, and analyze emerges from the linguistic practices we learn within society. Without language, much of what we call thought would not exist in recognizable form. Meaning, therefore, cannot be separated from human forms of life. This phrase carries enormous weight. A form of life includes the habits, activities, traditions, and shared behaviors through which a community exists. Language operates within these forms of life like a system of tools shaped by practical needs. Words gain meaning through the roles they play in those practices. This perspective transforms the philosopher's task once again. Instead of searching for hidden meanings behind words, the philosopher must examine how words are used within the activities of life. The investigation becomes empirical rather than metaphysical. We look at how people speak. We observe how language functions in different situations. We study how meaning shifts when the context changes. The philosopher becomes a careful observer of linguistic practice. Yet this approach also confronts us with an uncomfortable truth about ourselves. Human beings crave certainty. We prefer the illusion that every concept possesses a precise definition and stable boundaries. The idea that meaning depends on shifting patterns of use can feel unsettling. It suggests that language is more flexible and less rigid than we imagined. But Wittgenstein sees this flexibility as the true strength of language. A rigid system of definitions could never accommodate the complexity of human life. Language must adapt to new situations, new emotions, new forms of interaction. Its fluidity allows it to evolve alongside our changing experiences. Meaning remains stable, not because it is fixed, but because it is embedded within shared practices that guide how words are used. This subtle stability gives language its power. When we speak, we rarely analyze the structure of our words. We simply participate in patterns that others recognize. The meaning of our sentences emerges from this participation. Communication succeeds because we inhabit the same linguistic world. And yet, Wittgenstein recognized that this world is not uniform. Different human activities generate different patterns of language. The language used in science differs from the language of religion. The language of law differs from the language of friendship. The language of mathematics differs from the language of poetry. Each domain follows its own rules and expectations. A sentence that functions perfectly in one context may become meaningless in another. The word proof carries one meaning in mathematics and another in everyday conversation. The word faith operates differently in theology than in casual speech. Meaning shifts as the activity changes. This observation reveals a deeper structure within language itself. Instead of a single unified system governed by one logical form, language appears as a vast collection of distinct practices. Each practice organizes words according to its own internal rules. And once Wittgenstein began to recognize this diversity, a new image of language began to form in his mind. Language was not a mirror of reality. It was not a single logical structure. It was something far more dynamic. It resembled a collection of interconnected human activities, where words functioned according to rules shaped by the purposes of those activities themselves. And this realization led Wittgenstein to introduce one of the most powerful ideas in modern philosophy. Language is not a structure we observe from outside. Language is a game we learn to play. This is the idea that finally breaks Wittgenstein away from the rigid architecture of his early philosophy. If meaning arises from use, and if language lives inside human practices, then language cannot be understood as a single unified system governed by universal logical rules. It behaves more like a collection of activities. Each activity carries its own rules, expectations, and patterns of expression. Wittgenstein gave this insight a name that would reshape the philosophy of language forever: language games. The phrase sounds deceptively light, yet the concept carries enormous philosophical weight. A language game is any context in which words acquire meaning through their use within a specific human activity. Asking questions is a language game. Giving commands is another. Telling stories, negotiating agreements, making jokes, praying, apologizing, calculating numbers, writing poetry. Each of these practices forms a distinct way in which language operates. The meaning of words emerges from the rules governing these practices. To understand a word, therefore, is not simply to know its definition. It is to know how the word functions inside the game in which it appears. This insight overturns a powerful philosophical assumption. For centuries, philosophers believed that language possessed a single logical structure underlying all meaningful statements. Wittgenstein now sees that assumption as an illusion. Human language does not function as one system. It behaves like a vast landscape of overlapping practices, each with its own internal logic. Meaning shifts as the game changes. Consider the word truth. In science, truth refers to propositions supported by evidence and experiment. In a courtroom, truth concerns testimony and proof within legal procedure. In personal relationships, truth may mean honesty or sincerity rather than empirical verification. The word remains the same. The language game changes. Each context defines its own standards for how the word functions. Attempting to impose a single definition across all contexts leads immediately to confusion. Philosophers often fall into this trap. They search for the universal essence of concepts without recognizing that those concepts operate differently within different forms of life. Language games reveal the mistake. The first branch of Wittgenstein's argument becomes clear here. Words gain meaning through rules embedded in particular human activities. A chess piece has meaning only within the rules of chess. Outside the game, it is simply a carved object. A pawn means something because of the moves it is allowed to make, the role it plays within the strategy of the game, the expectations shared by players. Language works the same way. A word acquires meaning through the role it plays within a linguistic practice. Remove the practice and the word loses its function. Imagine someone uttering the word checkmate in a conversation about cooking. The sound remains, but the meaning collapses because the rules of the game have disappeared. Understanding language therefore requires understanding the activity in which the language appears. The second branch of Wittgenstein's insight exposes a deeper psychological pattern. Human beings often assume that misunderstanding arises because words lack precise definitions. Wittgenstein suggests the opposite. Misunderstanding often occurs because people unknowingly shift between different language games. A scientist discussing probability may use the word theory in a technical sense. A casual conversation may use the same word to mean speculation or guesswork. When participants fail to recognize that they are operating in different language games, confusion emerges. Each person believes they are using the same word. In reality, they are playing different games. This phenomenon explains countless philosophical disputes. Entire debates persist because participants silently operate within incompatible language games. Each side attempts to force the other into its own rules without realizing that the disagreement arises from the structure of language itself. Wittgenstein's response is radical in its simplicity. Instead of asking which definition of a word is correct, we should ask how the word is used within a particular language game. Meaning is not discovered through abstract analysis, but through observing the practice in which language functions. Philosophy becomes an investigation of linguistic activity. This transformation reshapes the relationship between language and thought. Human beings often imagine that thinking occurs inside the mind, while language merely expresses those thoughts outwardly. Wittgenstein dissolves this distinction. Thinking itself frequently operates through language games. When a mathematician solves an equation, the activity follows rules governing mathematical language. When a judge interprets a law, the reasoning unfolds within the language game of legal practice. When a friend offers comfort, the words function within the emotional language game of human relationship. Thought is not separate from these practices. It unfolds within them. This insight leads directly into the existential dimension of Wittgenstein's philosophy. Language games are not merely abstract linguistic structures. They are embedded in the ways human beings live. Every form of life generates its own patterns of speech. Every community develops its own linguistic habits, shaped by its activities and values. Language, therefore, reflects the texture of human existence. The way a society speaks reveals how it understands the world. Scientific communities create language games oriented toward measurement and explanation. Religious traditions develop language games oriented toward devotion and ritual. Artistic cultures cultivate language games oriented toward expression and interpretation. Each game produces its own standards of meaning. Confusion begins when we attempt to judge one language game using the rules of another. A scientific statement evaluated according to poetic standards will appear empty. A poem evaluated according to scientific criteria will appear irrational. But both function perfectly within their own practices. Wittgenstein's insight forces us to confront a psychological tendency that shapes intellectual life. Human beings seek universal explanations. We prefer to believe that one framework can explain everything. When we encounter different language games, we often attempt to reduce them to a single underlying structure. This desire creates philosophical tension. Because language refuses to obey it, human communication is too diverse, too fluid, too embedded in lived experience to be captured by one universal theory. Language games reveal the multiplicity of ways in which words acquire meaning. This multiplicity is not chaos. It is the natural expression of human life. To illustrate this idea, imagine a child learning language. The child does not begin by studying definitions. The child learns by participating in activities. Someone points to an object and says its name. Someone gives an instruction and expects obedience. Someone asks a question and waits for an answer. Through these interactions, the child gradually learns the rules of various language games, naming objects, requesting actions, expressing emotions, asking questions. Each practice forms a different pattern of linguistic behavior. The child does not analyze these patterns philosophically. The child learns them through participation. Meaning emerges from the activity itself. This process reveals something profound about the nature of human understanding. Language is not merely a system we observe intellectually. It is a practice we inhabit. Our ability to think, communicate, and interpret the world grows from our participation in these linguistic activities. We do not stand outside language games. We live within them. This realization has unsettling consequences for philosophy. If meaning depends on the rules of specific language games, then the philosopher cannot step outside language to analyze it from a neutral position. Philosophers themselves operate within language games, shaped by intellectual traditions and cultural practices. Philosophy becomes another game among many. Its value lies not in discovering ultimate truths beyond language, but in clarifying how language functions within human life. The philosopher examines the rules governing different practices and reveals where confusion arises when those rules are misunderstood. This method replaces metaphysical speculation with careful observation. Wittgenstein's work becomes an invitation to look closely at the ways we actually speak. Instead of constructing abstract theories about meaning, he urges us to examine everyday language. Watch how words function in ordinary situations. Observe the patterns that guide communication. Philosophical clarity emerges from attention to these details. Yet as Wittgenstein studied the diversity of language games, another question began to surface. If words gain meaning through their use in different practices, then many concepts may not possess a single feature shared by all instances. Instead, they might be connected through overlapping similarities, not through a strict definition, but through a network of relationships that resemble the way members of a family resemble one another without sharing a single identical trait. Concepts do not possess a single hidden essence. They are held together by a resemblance. This is the next blow Wittgenstein delivers against the philosophical obsession with definitions. For centuries, philosophers believed that every concept must have a core property shared by all its instances. To understand a concept meant to discover this essence. The search for definitions became a central activity of philosophy. Wittgenstein dismantles that expectation with a quiet but devastating observation. Many concepts function perfectly without possessing any single feature common to all cases. Instead, they form networks of overlapping similarities. He describes this pattern with a phrase that has become one of the most influential ideas in modern philosophy: family resemblance. The phrase captures something we recognize immediately in ordinary life. Members of a family resemble one another. A child may inherit the eyes of a mother, the voice of a father, the posture of a grandparent. Another child may share the same smile, but none of the other features. There is no single trait that every member possesses, yet the resemblance is unmistakable. The connection spreads through overlapping patterns rather than through a single defining essence. Wittgenstein believed many concepts operate in exactly this way. The word game offers his most famous example. Philosophers had long attempted to define what makes something a game. Is it competition? Many games involve competition, yet others do not. Is it amusement? Some games are playful, while others are serious contests. Is it rules? Some games contain strict rules, yet children often invent games spontaneously with changing guidelines. Each proposed definition fails, but the concept remains clear in practice. People recognize games without difficulty. Chess, football, hide and seek, solitaire, and countless other activities all fall under the concept. Yet, no single property unites them. Instead, the activities share overlapping similarities. Some involve competition, some involve skill, some involve rules, some involve amusement. These features appear in different combinations across different activities, forming a network of relationships rather than a single shared essence. The concept functions through resemblance. This insight forms the first layer of Wittgenstein's argument. Many concepts in language do not possess rigid boundaries. They operate through clusters of similarities distributed across different cases. Meaning emerges from these patterns. Philosophers often become trapped because they demand a precise definition where none exists. When the definition cannot be found, they conclude that the concept must conceal a deep metaphysical mystery. Wittgenstein offers a simpler explanation. The concept does not possess the structure philosophers expect. This realization carries a powerful philosophical consequence. Language is not built upon perfectly defined categories. Instead, it resembles a living network of concepts connected by overlapping similarities. Boundaries remain flexible. New cases can be incorporated as long as they share enough resemblance with existing ones. Meaning evolves with use. The second layer of Wittgenstein's insight exposes a psychological pattern hidden within human thinking. The mind craves clear borders. We prefer concepts that behave like geometric shapes with precise edges. Such clarity provides comfort. It gives the impression that our understanding of the world is stable and secure. But reality rarely obeys such precision. Human experiences blend into one another. Emotions overlap. Social practices shift across cultures. Concepts that describe these realities naturally inherit the same flexibility. Language mirrors that complexity. Instead of forcing rigid definitions onto flexible concepts, Wittgenstein urges us to observe how these concepts actually function. When we examine language closely, we see that many words operate through family resemblance rather than strict definition. The meaning of the concept spreads across a network of cases. This observation dissolves many philosophical puzzles. Consider the concept of knowledge. Philosophers have struggled for centuries to identify the exact conditions that transform belief into knowledge. Each proposed definition encounters counterexamples. New scenarios appear that challenge the boundaries of the concept. The debate continues without resolution. Wittgenstein's perspective suggests that the difficulty may arise from the assumption that knowledge must possess a strict definition. Perhaps the concept functions more like the word game. Different cases of knowledge share overlapping similarities without conforming to a single essential property. The philosophical struggle arises because the mind demands precision where language offers resemblance. Understanding this pattern changes the task of philosophy once again. Instead of searching for ultimate definitions, the philosopher observes how concepts operate across different contexts. The goal becomes mapping the network of similarities that connects various uses of a word. Clarity emerges through description rather than through theoretical construction. This shift reflects Wittgenstein's deeper vision of language as a living practice. Words do not derive their meaning from hidden essences. They gain significance through the patterns of use within human life. These patterns evolve as our activities change and our concepts adapt accordingly. Language remains flexible because human life remains flexible. And this flexibility reveals something unsettling about the relationship between language and thought. Human beings often assume that concepts correspond to stable structures in reality. But Wittgenstein shows that many concepts function through practical resemblance rather than metaphysical precision. Our understanding of the world therefore depends on patterns of use rather than on discovering hidden essences. This insight forces us to confront a quiet truth about ourselves. We often believe that clarity comes from defining concepts with absolute precision. Yet language frequently operates successfully without such precision. Communication thrives through shared practices and overlapping understandings. Meaning survives without rigid boundaries. But as Wittgenstein continued exploring this idea, another question began to emerge. If concepts depend on shared patterns of use within a community, then meaning cannot exist entirely within a single private mind. Language requires something more than individual experience. It requires standards that can be recognized and shared by others. Without such standards, words would lose the stability necessary for communication. And once Wittgenstein began to examine this possibility, he encountered one of the most profound philosophical challenges hidden within the nature of language itself. A language that belongs to only one mind is not a language at all. This is the unsettling conclusion Wittgenstein reaches once he follows his own insights to their logical edge. If meaning arises from use, if words gain their function through shared practices within forms of life, then the idea of a purely private language begins to collapse. The thought appears simple at first. A person might imagine creating words that refer to their own inner sensations, experiences that only they can feel and no one else can access. But Wittgenstein asks a devastating question. What would make such a language meaningful? The idea of a private language seems attractive because human experience often feels deeply personal. Pain, fear, joy, anxiety, hope. These experiences occur inside the individual. No one else can directly feel them. From this fact, philosophers have often assumed that language describing inner experience must refer to private mental objects. Wittgenstein dismantles that assumption. The problem does not lie in the privacy of experience itself. The problem lies in the structure of language. Language requires rules that distinguish correct use from incorrect use. Without such rules, words lose their stability. And rules require standards that can be recognized beyond a single moment of subjective feeling. Imagine someone decides to create a word that refers to a particular sensation they experience internally. Perhaps they mark the sensation with the letter S in a private diary each time it occurs. The intention seems clear. The word S is supposed to name that specific inner feeling. But Wittgenstein forces the thinker to confront a difficult question. How does the person know that each new use of S refers to the same sensation as before? There is no external standard to verify it, no shared rule that determines correct application. The person might believe they are using the word consistently, Yet nothing exists to distinguish genuine consistency from the illusion of it. Memory cannot solve the problem. Memory itself requires standards of correctness. If a person claims to remember a sensation, how do they confirm that the memory is accurate? The appeal to memory simply repeats the original difficulty. The rule becomes empty. The word begins to drift without anchor. This is the core of Wittgenstein's private language argument. A language that refers to purely private objects cannot establish the conditions necessary for meaning. Without public criteria that allow speakers to distinguish correct use from mistaken use, the concept of following a rule collapses. And without rules, language dissolves. The first branch of Wittgenstein's argument therefore strikes directly at the philosophical tradition that treated inner experience as the foundation of meaning. Philosophers had long assumed that words gain their significance by naming mental objects inside the mind. Language then becomes a bridge connecting these hidden inner worlds. Wittgenstein reveals a different picture. Language does not originate inside isolated minds. It arises within shared human practices. The meaning of a word depends on patterns of use that exist publicly within a community. Even words that describe inner sensations follow this pattern. Take the word pain. It appears to refer to something deeply private. No one else can feel another person's pain directly. Yet the word pain functions meaningfully within language because its use is governed by shared criteria. Children learn the word when they cry, when others respond with concern, when situations of injury occur. The word becomes connected to patterns of behavior and response. It does not gain meaning by pointing toward a mysterious private object hidden within consciousness. Instead, it operates within a network of human practices involving expression, reaction, and communication. Pain language works because it is public. This insight forms the second branch of Wittgenstein's argument. Meaning requires public standards. A rule cannot exist in complete isolation. To follow a rule means distinguishing correct application from incorrect application. Such distinction requires criteria that extend beyond a single individual's immediate feeling. Without those criteria, the idea of rule following becomes meaningless. Language, therefore, depends on the existence of a community that shares practices of correction, agreement, and recognition. These practices create the stability necessary for words to function. The philosophical consequences are profound. The idea that each person possesses a completely private mental language collapses. Thought itself begins to appear less isolated than philosophers once imagined. Our capacity to think using language develops within a social environment where words acquire meaning through shared activities. Even the language we use to describe our inner life depends on these public patterns. This realization forces us to confront a deep existential truth about the human condition. We often imagine ourselves as solitary minds, enclosed within our own experiences. The inner world appears separate from the external world of other people. But language reveals a different structure. Our ability to articulate even the most private feelings depends on participation in a shared linguistic world. Without that world, the words we use to describe ourselves would lose their meaning. The self is not sealed away from others as completely as we often believe. Wittgenstein's insight exposes the hidden social dimension of consciousness itself. The language through which we understand our thoughts and emotions originates within the practices of a community. Our inner life is shaped by the linguistic structures we inherit from the world around us. We learn how to speak about fear, desire, guilt, love, and suffering long before we fully understand those experiences ourselves. Language becomes the framework through which those experiences become intelligible. This idea unsettles the traditional philosophical picture of the mind. Instead of isolated individuals generating private meanings that are later expressed in language, Wittgenstein shows that meaning emerges from shared practices first. The individual mind develops within that framework. Language is not a bridge between isolated consciousnesses. It is the environment within which consciousness learns to articulate itself. This perspective dissolves many philosophical puzzles about the relationship between mind and language. The question of how private mental experiences can be communicated to others becomes less mysterious once we recognize that the language describing those experiences already belongs to a public practice. We do not invent the language of our inner life. We inherit it. And through that inheritance, we become capable of describing experiences that are otherwise silent. Yet Wittgenstein's investigation does not stop here. Once language is understood as a network of shared practices governed by rules, another philosophical task emerges. If meaning depends on the ways we use language within human life, then philosophy itself must reconsider its role. Perhaps philosophy should not attempt to build grand theories explaining the hidden structure of reality. Perhaps its task is far more modest and far more demanding. To examine the ways language leads us into confusion, to reveal the knots in our thinking created by misunderstandings of how words function, and to untangle those knots so that we can finally see our own thought clearly. Philosophy does not solve the deepest problems of life. It dissolves the confusions that prevent us from seeing clearly. This is the final transformation in Wittgenstein's vision. After dismantling the illusion of logical perfection, after exposing how meaning arises from use, after revealing language games, family resemblance, and the impossibility of a purely private language, he arrives at a radical conclusion about the nature of philosophy itself. Philosophy is not a theory about the world. It is a therapy for the mind. For centuries, philosophers believed their task was to explain reality. They searched for the ultimate substance of the universe, the hidden structure of consciousness, the foundation of knowledge, the essence of meaning. Each generation constructed new systems, each claiming to penetrate deeper into the nature of existence. Yet Wittgenstein saw something disturbing beneath this tradition. Many philosophical problems are not problems about the world. They are problems about how language entangles our thinking. The philosopher therefore confronts a strange responsibility. The goal is not to produce new explanations. The goal is to untangle the knots created by language itself. Language forms patterns that guide our thought. These patterns usually function without difficulty. In everyday life, we navigate them effortlessly. But when language is stretched beyond its natural context, confusion emerges. Words begin to behave in ways that mislead the mind. A philosophical problem is often the result of such distortion. The first layer of Wittgenstein's argument becomes clear here. Philosophy must shift from explanation to clarification. When someone asks, "What is the essence of time?" or "Where does the mind exist inside the body?" the instinct of traditional philosophy is to search for a theoretical answer. Entire systems arise from this impulse. Yet Wittgenstein suspects that the question itself may already be confused. The task of philosophy is therefore diagnostic. Instead of answering the question, the philosopher examines the language that produced it. How is the word time actually used in human life? How does the concept of mind function within ordinary speech? What activities give these words their meaning? When this examination is performed carefully, the philosophical puzzle often dissolves. The confusion was not hidden in the world, it was hidden in language. This transformation gives philosophy a role similar to therapy. A therapist does not solve the external problems of a patient's life. Instead, the therapist helps the patient recognize patterns of thought that create unnecessary suffering. Philosophy performs a similar function for the intellect. It reveals the hidden structures of language that trap our thinking. Once those structures become visible, the illusion loses its power. The problem disappears. This disappearance is not dramatic. No grand discovery occurs. No new scientific fact is revealed. Instead, the mind experiences a quiet clarity. We see the situation as it truly is. Wittgenstein believed this clarity represents the real achievement of philosophy. The second layer of his insight pushes deeper into the psychological dimension of human thought. The human mind is easily seduced by abstraction. We construct concepts and then begin treating them as objects that must exist somewhere in reality. Language encourages this illusion. Grammar gives us nouns that appear to name things. Words such as consciousness, existence, infinity, or identity behave grammatically like objects. Because of this structure, we begin asking questions as if these concepts refer to hidden entities waiting to be discovered. Where is consciousness located? What is the substance of existence? Does infinity exist somewhere beyond the universe? The grammar of these questions creates the appearance of depth. Yet Wittgenstein suspects that the appearance itself is misleading. The problem arises because language allows us to form sentences that look meaningful, even when they lack clear use within any language game. Philosophy must expose this illusion. This exposure requires patience and discipline. The philosopher must resist the temptation to invent new explanations. Instead, the philosopher returns repeatedly to the ordinary use of language. How do we actually speak? How do words function within real situations? What roles do they play within human life? The investigation often reveals that the philosophical puzzle emerged from a misunderstanding of how language operates. Once the misunderstanding is removed, the problem dissolves. This process resembles untangling a knot. A knot appears complex because multiple strands of rope have twisted together. Pulling harder does not solve the problem. The knot must be examined carefully. Each strand must be loosened until the structure becomes visible. Philosophy works in the same way. The knots of language are untangled, one strand at a time. This vision of philosophy demands humility. It rejects the heroic image of the philosopher as a discoverer of ultimate truths. Instead, the philosopher becomes a patient observer of language, someone who listens carefully to how words are used and who intervenes when confusion arises. The work is subtle but powerful, because once language becomes clear, many intellectual struggles vanish. Wittgenstein believed that philosophical clarity often leads to a surprising realization. Many of the questions that appear deepest cannot be answered through theory at all. They belong to the domain where language reaches its limits: ethics, beauty, the meaning of life. These questions do not disappear because they are meaningless. They persist because they express something fundamental about human existence. Yet language cannot capture them in the form of propositions describing facts. They remain beyond explanation. And here Wittgenstein's philosophy circles back to the boundary he discovered earlier. There are truths that cannot be said, but only shown through the way we live. Philosophy cannot transform those truths into theories. What it can do is remove the confusions that prevent us from seeing them clearly. Once those confusions dissolve, the world itself begins to appear differently. Ordinary language reveals its hidden complexity. Everyday life becomes a stage upon which meaning quietly unfolds. The philosopher no longer seeks a final system that explains everything. Instead, the philosopher learns to look carefully at the way language shapes our understanding of reality. And in that careful attention, something remarkable happens. The problems that once seemed impossible begin to fade, leaving behind a strange silence in which the world can finally be seen without the distortions that language had quietly imposed all along. Philosophy ends where clarity begins. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of Wittgenstein's journey. After dismantling the illusion that language perfectly mirrors reality, after exposing how grammar can trap thought in endless puzzles, and after revealing that meaning emerges from use within human life, Wittgenstein refuses to leave us with another grand theory. He offers something far more unsettling. There is no final philosophical system waiting at the end of inquiry. For centuries, philosophy pursued ultimate explanations. Thinkers searched for the hidden structure of the universe, the essence of knowledge, the foundation of meaning. Yet Wittgenstein's path moves in the opposite direction. The deeper he examined language, the clearer one truth became. Many of the questions that appear deepest are not solved by better theories. They dissolve when we see how language has misled us. The task of philosophy, therefore, is not to build intellectual monuments. It is to remove illusions. Language is powerful because it shapes how we think about the world, but that power carries danger. Grammar allows us to form sentences that look meaningful even when they hide confusion. Concepts appear solid simply because language gives them names. Entire philosophical problems arise from this quiet deception. Wittgenstein's work reveals the mechanism behind the illusion. When language is misunderstood, thought becomes tangled. We begin searching for mysterious entities that grammar seems to promise. We imagine hidden substances, ultimate essences, invisible structures behind ordinary experience. The philosopher in this moment resembles someone lost in a labyrinth built from words. The escape does not require discovering a secret exit. It requires recognizing that the walls of the labyrinth were constructed by language itself. Once this realization appears, philosophy changes its character. The philosopher no longer attempts to explain everything. Instead, The philosopher examines the way language operates within human life. Questions are not answered with theories, but clarified by observing how words function in practice. And often, something surprising happens. The problem disappears. Not because the world has been explained, but because the confusion that produced the question has dissolved. The intellect suddenly sees the structure of its own mistake. The knot loosens. What once appeared as a deep mystery reveals itself as a misunderstanding of language. This is why Wittgenstein often described philosophy as a form of therapy. The philosopher does not cure the world. The philosopher cures our thinking. Yet this therapeutic vision leads to a final and profound realization. Some of the questions that matter most to human existence do not vanish when language becomes clear. They remain. Ethics, beauty, meaning, the value of life. These are not puzzles created by grammar. They belong to the deeper fabric of human experience, but they cannot be captured through philosophical theories. Language reaches its limit when it attempts to transform these dimensions into factual propositions. They cannot be explained like objects in the world. They can only be shown through how we live, how we choose, how we confront suffering and freedom. Philosophy at this point must step back. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it is clarity. Wittgenstein did not give philosophy a final doctrine. Instead, he gave it a mirror. In that mirror, we see how language shapes our understanding of reality. We see how easily thought becomes trapped in its own constructions. And we see how clarity emerges when we return to the ordinary ways language functions within life. The result is both humbling and liberating. Philosophy does not stand above human life as a system explaining everything. It walks beside it, revealing the structures that guide our thinking and the illusions that distort it. And when those illusions finally fall away, something simple yet profound becomes possible. We stop chasing explanations that language cannot provide. We look again at the world itself. And in that quiet moment, thought becomes still enough to see reality without the shadows that language once cast across it.